The research that I'm talking about today is informed by some work that I have done on the merging of industrial security and humanitarian aid practice in the offshore of the Gulf of Guinea and the Gulf of Mexico that I started about 10 years ago, and that sort of sparked my interest in some of the dynamics around the ways in which populations were being physically removed from strategic sites where coastal installations had been placed. And one of the elements of this that is particularly salient to examining what's going on in the international seabed is that primarily the interest that firms have in moving to these sites is because they're external to social regulation. And in fact, firms are fairly blunt about that. So just to sort of put this in the context of that earlier research, these are International Maritime Organization maps. These are actually 10 years old now. They produce their data in different forms at this point. But what they are attempting to do is represent the numbers of attacks by pirates, allegedly committed attacks and allegedly attempted attacks in particular zones that I think are part of sort of constituting some of the dynamics around markets, financial markets, and risk evaluation for different kinds of investments. And they also set up different sorts of regions as inherently volatile or inherently secure. So they encourage different kinds of spatial fixes where you move resources out of volatile sites into more secure sites for processing, and they create some of the dynamics around the ways in which the global south is now integrated into the transnational markets. So Nautilus Minerals, which I'm talking about a bit today, is nominally based in Canada, originally formed in Australia, and demonstrates, I think, in some of the strategic positioning that Canada and Australia and New Zealand are taking, a certain form of new imperialism, to follow the work that colleagues are doing, in which smaller states that have historically been seen as relatively benign are now acting in support of different kinds of extractive capital to gain access and to create enclosures over the deep seabed. But the capital that's involved with these operations is distinctly global. And so what's interesting about Nautilus is that it has considerable investment from the third richest Russian, some investment as well from Omani capital, the presence of Anglo-Americans, so one of the largest international mining firms, and Teck Resources, which is Canadian. There's also interests of Barrick Gold through one of Barrick's subsidiaries, Placer Dome, in these activities. So there's a set of different extractive interests that are represented in this move to try and take additional sites in the offshore. And the spaces are described as well in the paper. But this is sort of the context, the kind of deregulatory or re-regulatory context in which this kind of activity is being undertaken. So basically, the reduced social disturbance makes these sites attractive. And despite the considerable capital that's involved in extracting what so far appear to be relatively small amounts of minerals, ultimately, the ability to sort of remove the site of extraction from contested dynamics is advantageous. So at the 2013 meeting of the International Seabed Authority, the Nautilus Minerals presented a proposal for a joint venture with something called the Enterprise in the deep seabed. And so there are many experts on the Caribbean here who probably have considerably more knowledge of the lengthy history of the International Seabed Authority and can maybe comment on that in discussion. But the Enterprise was initially conceived in the period of the G77, basically, to create a context in which there would be means for redistributing whatever resources were extracted from international waters, known as the area, to developing countries. And so it had strong sort of connotations of the new international economic order and global social justice and redistribution that came out of anti-colonial and decolonial movements. The main ideas that were embedded in the notion of the enterprise and in the negotiation of some of the other dynamics in the International Seabed Authority were ultimately dismantled in the 1994 implementation agreement that accompanied the ratification of the Convention on the Law of the Sea. And that implementation agreement was signed roughly at the time of the World Trade Organization, and so represented, the neoliberal sort of consensus that had come out in the period. Although, as I mentioned in the paper, some of the commentators in the period also saw the willingness of the Global South to make this compromise is based on the knowledge at that moment that commodity prices were not sufficiently high enough to support deep sea extraction for at least another couple of decades. So given that the moment for this actual activity seemed delayed, there was time, in a sense, to try to negotiate an agreement or negotiate specifics of production agreements when the actual seabed mining were to commence. So in the last 10 years, following the commodity boom that David was talking about, there has been sort of a flurry of interest in trying to develop some of these spaces that are in international waters. And the main area to which some of the contracts have been given is in a region called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which forms part of ocean space in the area in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, so between Hawaii and Mexico. And Nautilus proposed to take 8 blocks in the area in a joint venture to establish the enterprise in their attempt to, some would say, monopolize the space at the summer meetings. Now, what was very interesting to observe at those meetings was the role that Brazil seemed to be playing in sort of acting as a representative of the interests of the South, broadly speaking, but perhaps also Brazilian mining capital in terms of trying to prevent any sort of regime being put into place that would not have anti-monopoly elements or that would not be sufficiently stringent when it came to environmental diligence. And of course, because the environmental specifics of the production regime have not been determined yet, it's in the interest of firms to try to get in for exploration now before maybe some more stringent regulatory dynamics are put into place, if that were to happen, which I think there are interests in that not happening. But Nautilus already is positioning itself in the Pacific and has spaces within the area of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone through something called Nauru Ocean Resources, which was a state-sponsored firm from Nauru, but in which they have now a 50% interest, and through Tonga Offshore Mining Capital, also sponsored by Tonga, but which is 100% subsidiary of Nautilus. So their interest in the space and their attempt to sort of create a situation in which other firms wouldn't have access is, I think, salient to understanding what's going on here. So what I argue in the paper is that there's a couple of different things happening. One is that there seems to be, an attempt to create the sort of conjoint territorial / financial dominance through being able to state that this particular firm has reserves in this space and reserves that will not be granted to competitors if they were successful in receiving this agreement, which they weren't so far. The other is that the ability of transnationals to move into this area is also sort of shaped by the longer history of the International Seabed Authority, where the language of the common heritage of mankind is still very prominent. So there's, at least symbolically, a lot of discussion about the need to redistribute these resources or to be employing them in a form that would be equitable and just. And so this looks to some extent like some sort of an ocean grab in a way, one that they weren't able to get, but that has those kinds of features for a number of reasons. One is that it would prevent others from having access. One of the other reasons is because it provides direct access. So the majority of the firms that have contracts now with the International Seabed Authority are actually state firms. So this is, Philip McMichael referred in a special issue that Matthias was editing with others to this as security mercantilism. The other, third sort of element of this is that it looks like a kind of an attempt to sort of push differential accumulation in the extractive sector, where particular groups of firms, this is taking from the work of Jonathan Nitzan and Simsham Bichler, who've argued that there's a particular element of sort of power involved with the financial grabs that are involved in the extractive sector and other areas of capitalist activity. So part of, what I'm trying to understand with this paper, and which will involve another few years of work for sure, is the way in which the regime is both sort of public and privately managed. So this is, the result of the implementation agreement. And it is one in which the International Seabed Authority is formally the regulator, but in which private firms are operating with protection of states that sponsor them. So what was also, very evident, for instance, is that firms that had longer-term historical access to the region prior to the ratification of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea are present within those that are today mining the area. So in the period leading up to the ratification of UNCLOS, there was what was known as the Reciprocating States Agreement, in which the United States and various other northern powers basically tried to protect early investment in the deep seabed by their firms that were already working in the area. And they were able to work in the area under sort of Grotian notions of the freedom of the seas. And those agreements were ultimately displaced by the International Seabed Authority, but they were offered certain kinds of preferential access. And of course, they already had advantages because of the fact that they had been collecting data. So among these firms was Lockheed Martin. And Lockheed Martin's British subsidiary, UK Seabed Resources, is one of the main private firms now seeking access. And so this sort of draws from this long historical relationship between military and extractive sectors, and between sort of a transition, I guess one could say, from British to US imperialism that provides the data for that particular firm to operate in the offshore. What I found interesting is watching the Australian, New Zealand and Canadian delegations describe themselves as unified as the Kanzi states in their efforts to sort of facilitate or speak in delicate terms in favor of considering the Nautilus proposal, which will be, is currently tabled and will be considered by various commissions of the authority over the next year. So I think time is up. I'll basically leave it at that. Will be hard for you to see.